Second normal form, we said, creates many-to-one relationships by separating static data from transactional data. It eliminates redundant data or data which is not fully dependent on the primary key or a composite. In other words, when you have composite primary keys. Look at this table here. What is not fully dependent on the primary key? The invoice total amount is fully dependent on the invoice number. The invoice date is fully dependent on the invoice number. The customer name and address are not fully dependent on the invoice number. As I said before, I can have customers in my database, but I don't necessarily have to have invoices issued against them. They may not have purchased anything this month. They may never have purchased anything at all. So what do? I go and create a new entity. I'm actually just copying and pasting it. And I'm going to call it, guess what? Customer. And it's going to contain these two columns in it. And actually, I'll go to the attribute editor to make it a little bit simpler. I'll delete this, and this is my primary key. Once again, I'm identifying my customer by the name of the customer. And let's go into my attribute editor, and we can remove these things from here because they're no longer required on this table. What am I doing here? What have I done? I've actually created a many-to-one relationship between the invoice and customer. In other words, as opposed to the last time where I created a one-to-many relationship between invoice and invoice item, I've now created one-to-many relationship between master invoice and detail invoice item table. Now I'm actually removing information not dependent on the primary key, namely the customer information, and I'm creating a many-to-one relationship between invoice and customer. Essentially, the customer name is more or less dependent on the invoice number, to be more specific about it, because invoices are applicable to customers. However, because I can have customers who don't have invoices, it's not specifically exactly precisely correct if you really want to get into the academic details. The point is this customer address column is not specifically dependent on the invoice number. It doesn't have to be stored with the invoice, basically. That's second normal form. My perspective is that first normal form is removing repeating information, transactional information which is duplicated, and you can't determine the number of items within that subset child object. So I can't determine the number of items on an invoice. Obviously not. An invoice has many lines when written on paper. There could be 5, 10, 1, or 50 items. Obviously there can't be 0. There's not much point in having that. That relationship shouldn't actually be 0. But we won't worry about the specific details of that right now. Second normal form has actually taken static information out of the invoice and put it into its own entity so that I don't have to repeat the customer address within every invoice because it's pointless and it's a waste of space. That is second normal form.